stop and take a trip down on my block. Where you see hidden potential, young minds sharper than pencil. And ain't afraid to speak their mind if they got something against you. We standing with you, we tackle issues like civic pride. Hate will cease to exist, let's put our differences aside. From my side to your side, from Dutchtown to South Side, from Penrose to North Side, from Benton Park to Old North to West End to West Side. We blessed when we step out, we stand down, rise up, stand together, wise up.
This is StitchCast Studio, produced by St. Louis Story Stitchers in St. Louis, Missouri.
This is a special edition of StitchCast Studio, the Divided City, featuring our special guest, Dr. Lori Punch, a critical care surgeon and activist in the fight against gun violence. She directs Stop the Bleed STL, located inside the T, so check it out. They say who that, but you already knew that. That be them story stitches, story stitches, story stitches, story stitches, story stitches.
Hello, everybody. First, I want to thank you for tuning in to StitchCast Studio. I am your host, Branden Lewis, and I am accompanied by a couple members of our StitchCast. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. First, on the StitchCast, we got Josh. Say what's up, Josh.
What's good? What's good? Good to see y'all again.
We also got Trey. How you feeling, Trey?
I'm feeling good. What's the word?
What's good with you, man? And also, we have Emira that's going to be joining us a little later. But Emira, if you've ever seen a Story Stitches podcast, you probably know who Emira is. Emira needs no introduction at all. But for the real introduction, we're being joined by a very special, I don't even know where to start. Okay, we're talking about awards, founding nonprofits, schooling in several parts of the country, doing surgery in several parts of the country, and as if that's not enough, piano. Somehow they found time to learn how to also play piano. So please join me in welcoming Josh, Trey, unmute. Please join me in welcoming the very special Dr. Punch. Dr. Punch, how are you?
Hey, what's up? Music
absolutely,
is life.
Absolutely. And I'm a piano player myself, so we definitely gonna get into that. I know we're gonna talk about some heavier topics or whatnot, but if you don't mind starting off a little lighthearted, can you tell us a little bit about your musical background?
I can't overemphasize how much music has meant to me in my life. Yes, I began playing piano around the age of 10, taking $2 piano lessons from Miss Elizabeth Carter in East Liverpool, Ohio. I did a story about that when I did a TED Talk, and I am not over-exaggerating the role that experience of playing side by side with a gospel maestro, right? Like just somebody who danced across the keys and gave her whole heart to her community really helped me see the power of music to communicate and connect people from a very, very young age. And then I started tinkering, through school, learned the trumpet, but really I was bass all the way. Eventually they gave me a tuba. And then I went to college. I learned how to play the bass for the gospel choir there, and then played in a party band in med school. And all along the way, that connection, literally now I understand, was my therapy. That was my way of healing my mind and balancing my worlds, where, kind of learning these really intense things about the body and being in a very intense environment, and then coming to these spaces where I could connect with people through music and art. So yes, music all the way has always been part of my life. And now I play light acoustic when I can.
Gotcha. So in med school, you were playing in bands and whatnot?
Yeah, I was.
Wow.
My fellow medical students thought I was pretty crazy, but I worked really hard in undergrad. And when I got to med school, I slowed down a little bit and really started thinking about, what I wanted in life, what I enjoyed in life. And so, yeah, I took a little bit easier in medical school. And I'm so glad I did. The band was called Swivel Hips, and they still, there's different members of them in Connecticut who still get together and play sometimes. So it was great memories, great times.
Beautiful. Speaking of music, trauma, therapy, you've already touched on how music was your therapy. I know music is definitely my therapy. I want to talk a little bit. We're gonna get into trauma, and I want to talk a little bit about therapy. I'm an advocate for therapy. I think everybody should have a therapist, even if they don't feel like anything's wrong with them. Is therapy really the solution to trauma, to suffering, and all of these depression, all of of these things, is therapy really that smoking gun, so to speak, that everybody typically ignores or doesn't have access to, but could help them greatly?
So I think it's an excellent question, and one that the community really needs to grapple with differently. I mean, first of all, you got to break down what is therapy, because there's all kinds of different therapy. There are people, like yourself, who are eloquent. You can use words to express your feelings, and your mind has a grasp on what's going on in your heart, soul, and body. But not everybody has that kind of wiring. There are some people for whom a physical reality, a emotional reality needs to be expressed in other ways. And that's where I think something like music can come in, because it lets us, I don't have to explain this to you, right? It lets us say things that we can't say with our words just sitting down with somebody and talking. The truth is, though, right? Trauma lives in our body. Trauma is not a mental thing alone. Yes, there are memories. Yes, there are cognitive processes that occur in our brain. Yes, our nervous system is involved, but our nervous system is just as much present in our body, right, as it is in our skull. And trauma lives in our body. Your body doesn't forget exposure to trauma, where it's physical, whether it's emotional, financial, whatever it is. And that trauma lives in our body, in our sympathetic nervous system, in our flight or fight response, in our cortisol levels, and everything that gets us through our day. And so for me, I find things like music, things like lifting weights, things like dancing, things like building things with hammers and nails. That's my therapy. And what I really would like to see, right, is more therapy, as we talk about in the classic sense, engaging people with a both and. For instance, my son did speech and language therapy when he was younger at a place called Leaps and Bounds. And it's basically a gym. And the therapists go into the gym with the kids. And while they're jumping, bouncing, hyping, crawling, they're going over speech with them. They're doing fine motor with them. And I think that's the bigger truth of how most people's bodies are. When we think about the stigma around mental health, I kind of get it. Because you know what? It doesn't work for everybody, but that doesn't mean they don't need it. And if I could get somebody to sit down, play some basketball, lift some weights, listen to some music, and vibe for a second, I bet you I could start helping them connect their words to their body, and then therapy would be therapeutic. And that's actually one of the things I'm doing in a new project I have at my building, the T, called the BRIC. It's the Bullet Related Injury Clinic. And it's a clinic for people who are recovering from having been shot or having somebody they know be shot. And in the clinic, we don't just sit and talk. There's opportunities to move. I've got a basketball hoop. You can get up and move around the space. We just put in a set of weights. And we don't just use our words. We use our whole beings to get through trauma.
Wow, beautiful. So for someone who doesn't have access to, you mentioned building, working out, for someone who doesn't have access to therapy in the traditional sense, for example, somebody with a borderline personality disorder who sorely may need therapy but isn't in a position where they can, afford it or it's not offered or whatever the case may be. What are some things that we can do in our own lives every day to kind of help with trauma or whatever else we may need therapy for?
So here's the exciting thing. First of all, I do want to say there are always resources, the behavioral health response, as well as this new program, Show Me Hope, Missouri, which is really, really cutting edge crisis therapy in the setting of COVID. Those resources I'll send to you so you can tag those to this podcast. So there always is help. There's also, for instance, suicide helplines. Let's make sure folks have those resources. You're never alone. Number one. Number two, here's the magic thing here, right? Okay. It goes both ways. The same way trauma does not just live in your mind, healing can live in your body. And so the things that we do to our bodies have a lot to do with the processes that go on in our brains. Do you know that there is a theory that chronic depression is just as much the consequence of chronic inflammation from an improper balance of bacteria in your intestines as it is any other thing going on with serotonin in your brain?
I had no idea.
Yeah. So here's my approach. It's very simple, right? is very, very basic. But the thing about it is, because of that, everyone has access to it. So first we start with managing pain. Unseen, untreated, unhealed pain in whatever form absolutely puts our minds into a depressive state, no matter what our starting point is. And I think it's very, very important to check in with your body, see where your pain is. If it's physical, there's all kinds of things, rest and elevation and ice packs and ibuprofen and Tylenol and just time that can help you deal with the pain your body might be going through. And if it's emotional pain, it's important to be like, wow, man, when that went down, that really wasn't cool with me. And like, that hurts. And so that is one of the first statements we have to be able to make, because we don't have to just be tough. We can recognize that we're in pain, and we can start to think about how we can take a minute to treat that pain, whether it's listening to your favorite song, trying to get at least 15 minutes of sunshine on a day where it's at least over 40, looking at your favorite videos, sitting down and watching a show you used to watch when you were a kid that just makes you feel happy, like basic stuff, right? So that's pain. So next, after that, is going to be sleep. Your mind heals when you sleep. And sleep is one of our most, I think, misunderstood things, for people, especially, I'm going to say it, young folks. A lot of people stay up, they're on their phones, they're letting their cell phones and the unnatural light of that cell phone stimulate them and make them think it's time to be awake when really it's time to be asleep. It's very, very important to try to regulate your sleep cycle, especially when you're going through something. Now, you don't necessarily have to sleep 10.5 hours at night, but you at least need to try to go to bed and try, especially to get yourself on some kind of rhythm. Your body has these things called circadian rhythms that tell you when it's time to be awake, when it's time to be asleep. And if you're always messing with them, it's just like a beat, right? If you're always messing with it, you never let it drop. Like you never get into the groove. So getting into the groove of sleep is really important. I use sleep supplements. There's, maybe people believe in melatonin or not, but that's something that helps me, and then turning my phone off. Okay, after sleep is going to be eating. I already mentioned, what you eat. You are what you eat. And I'm telling you, eating food that is as close to actual food, the way it comes out of the earth as possible, is really, really good. So getting those plants in some kind of form that they're not completely processed, and thinking very consciously about the animal products you put in your body. Those are the kinds of things that can help you have a healthy intestine, and your intestines being healthy have a lot to do with your whole body state of inflammation, and your whole body state of inflammation has a lot to do with all kinds of things that can go wrong with your joints, with your heart, and with your mind. So eating, super, super important, along with that, water. Next, your thoughts. Managing and recognizing, even just reflecting on your thoughts and the stress that's inside of them. A lot of times I see people go through something, and not only do they not recognize their pain, but they don't recognize the way in which that stress is causing them to see the whole world around them as messed up. My job's messed up, my family's messed up, everybody's messed up, and everyone's out to get me. That is a common thing. What is that? What is that? That is your brain's stress response trying to keep you safe, because you feel threatened because something has gone down. But while that is real inside your brain, it's not necessarily the case. I have had people where all I have said to them is in the hospital, "Hey, how are you?" And they're like, "What you mean, how am I? What? And I'm like, dude, but I realize when you have trauma, just like when you're sick, anything that anyone does towards you can feel like a threat. And so coming in and thinking about those thoughts, and then doing something to turn on the opposite of your stress response, which is breath work. When you take a deep breath and you stretch your diaphragm, you singers out there understand this, you literally stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of your fight or flight response. And you help your body enter into a state of relaxation, which then frees up your brain to be your higher self, to recognize, okay, my job isn't messed up, my family isn't messed up, I'm not messed up, it's just some stuff going down right now, and we're going to be okay. So these methods, along with being being very, very careful about what toxins you expose yourself with to, whether it's toxic people or toxic substances, are what I call the how to heal method to dealing with trauma. Eating, sleeping, managing your stress and thoughts, handling and acknowledging your pain, and being mindful of your relationship with toxins. And this is something I think anybody and everybody can do, whether or not they have access to a therapist. Because here's the real trippy thing. You know who is the best one in position to help you overcome your trauma? You. So self-care and doing these things as self-care is very, very, very powerful. You have access to them every single day. And everything that I'm doing here at the T and the Brick is about that kind of method and making sure people have access to those really basic but accessible tools.
Hey everybody, it's time right now for our Pick the City Up art interlude, featuring an original piece by artist and songwriter KP Dennis titled Bang in the Night.
It's like walking on a tightrope out here. It's a jungle, you know what I'm saying? I wish I could just tell you see you later, but that's called taking it for granted, 'cause we don't know.
Post-traumatic, schizophrenic, take a trip with panic. Close to static, click a bandits, came to flip the planet. They call them red-handed, 45, semi-auto. Death wishing on a mission like it's no tomorrow. He yellow tip the spits and follow, listen, pay attention. He bottled up with tension off the whip, your day was sentence. Looking for repentance and redemption in this cold world of sad reality for urban boys and girls who can't run from the sound of the clock. Rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. All my life, man, it's the same fight. I'm sick of things going bang in the night. Can't run from the sound of the clock. Rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. You know these bullets ain't got no names, right? Wish it was strange, you bang in the night. Was he maniacal? Well, tell me what's the impetus? 'Cause everybody present red rum on the injured list. How you play the judge, jury, bailiff, executioner? Yeah, got a problem with you messing the solution up. The pain and the poverty permeates the bloodstream. Full-blown addicted to shooting like you a trigger fiend. What you mean, self-hating per usual? And if you see it differently, you're seeing it's delusional. The sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. All my life, man, it's the same fight. I'm sick of things going bang in the night. Can't run from the sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. You know these bullets ain't got no names, right? Wish it was strange, hearing bang in the night. Put the gun down, wasn't just another slogan. It's a way of life and the memory of the chosen. Mental health counseling, 'cause families are broken. And what can people do with all these pent up emotions? A whole lot of rage is the why of my city, bruh. If you ain't living next to the ones who quit to spit 50, bruh. Yesterday people lost some things, today get hit pretty close to home. Tomorrow all this might be gone. Can't run from the sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. All my life, man, it's the same fight. I'm sick of things going bang in the night. Can't run from the sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. You know these bullets ain't got no names, right? Wish it was strange, hearing bang in the night. We got the blood of the young on our hands, and if we stay divided, then you know we won't stand. I wish it was sweet, but on me it's plain scary. These cowards keep killing, I'm seeing babies get buried. It's necessary that you stay aware of your survival. Pick up an occupation, try to interrupt the cycle. 'Cause if we let depression and anxiety prevail, that means we fail to plan, so we planning to fail. When the sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. All my life, man, it's the same fight. I'm sick of things going bang in the night. Can't run from the sound of the clock, rise to get shot, bodies get found on the block. Just hit the ground but they pop, shoot up for nothing, they wanna be down with the spot. Boy. You know these bullets ain't got no names, right? Wish it was strange, hearing bang in the night.
Yeah, I was just curious about you explaining more of the purpose of artists beyond just self-care towards ourselves. I'm a visual artist, but I'm just speaking for like, what is the artist's role in helping other people deal with their trauma or just revealing issues, talking about real stuff. Like, what is in your opinion an artist's role in that?
Ooh, I'm so glad you asked that question. This is something I used to really ponder a lot in medical school, because this idea of mental health hygiene, the same way we have fluoride that lets us maintain dental hygiene, or the same way we have seatbelts so that we have safety when we're on the roads. There is such a thing as hygiene, a way of maintaining yourself before problems arise. And I believe that art has historically always played the role of being the guardian of our mental health hygiene. If you think about, let's break down why. What happens when our mental health is threatened or when we have trauma? We become, in some ways, separated from ourselves, right? We don't have, right, the connection to all that we are, because either through threat or an internal sickness, we are not connecting to all of our body and brain smoothly, right? What is art but self-expression and the musing and the watching and the taking in of others' self-expression? And I think that I literally can't think of something more healing, right, for someone who is internally broken than to literally stitch themselves back together by expressing what they can express through art. And, you know, art is so gentle in some ways, right? Because it does not judge. It doesn't have to. I mean, I know artists, all right, are super critical of themselves, but the truth is, whatever you comes out is what is you, and it's beautiful and it's fine. I mean, there's not a lot of other spaces, right, where we get to be that way. There's not a lot of other spaces in human existence, right, where what you do is just okay by definition, because the whole point is self-expression. So I think artists can do a lot of things. One, they can be well themselves. You know, I think maintaining your own well-being is core if you want to help others. Two, they can create images, sounds, experiences of self-expression that help us reflect. And then three, they can teach. They can teach us how. I mean, somebody sat down with me and taught me EGBDF, right? Like somebody taught me that. And I think teaching whatever art form it is one of the most beautiful things that we can do. So yes, I think artists are the guardians of our mental health, and I wish that our society valued art in that way. Instead, we value things that, yes, have meaning and are valuable. The medical world takes a lot of the brunt of this, but there's so much more I think we could be doing. And I'm glad that we have virtual platforms like this to experience art. I really think it's one of the, I mean, how many of you are just dying for a concert, right?
Right.
I know I am. And so I'm hoping, and I'm glad that you have taken this on. We've got to keep getting art in front of people one way or the other.
Definitely. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. I'm glad you said that, because I kind of came to the same conclusion myself in a way, in that I believe that I believe that your job as an entertainer almost is to make other people's lives easier. People that can't express themselves the way that you express yourself. As you just said, you know, even just hearing in a song that somebody feels how I thought I was the only person that felt, you know, even little things like that are very helpful. It's helpful to know that you're not alone.
How does dealing with trauma at a young age kind of rewire the brain? And is there any way to undo what was done? Not the situation, but what's happening in the brain? Or is there any way to help the process, you know, processing that trauma and the situation that happened to them?
This is a really great question. And I am not an expert on the neurobiology of childhood exposures to trauma, but the truth is the brain simply does not develop certain connections. There's literally parts of the brain that are smaller. Development is not the same when a child is exposed to high levels of trauma, high cortisol levels, and the stress that we just kind of talked about. So what can be done? Interestingly, the study after study, thing after thing that I've read, and talk after talk that I've heard, is that the most protective thing a child can have in enduring exposure to trauma is a stable relationship with a healthy adult. One is adequate. And so this is where you hear stories of people going through unbelievable childhood experiences and emerging as well-balanced, quote unquote, whatever that means, but like healthy, emotionally intact, able to navigate the world adults. And it's always what? It was a grandma. It was an uncle. It was a stepmom. It was somebody, that one person who became for them a tether through the storm. So where it gets really hard, right, is when someone makes it into young adulthood and they have never had that, even a glimmer of that kind of relationship. What happens to that person, I believe, having talked to many, many people in that circumstance, is they no longer believe the world is a place which is either safe or has their own best interest at heart ever. And once an adult human being has decided the world is never safe and nothing about it is interested in their well-being, that adult will struggle immensely for a lifetime and will have to come to the conclusion on their own. You can't save people, y'all. I wish. You can't save people. They're going to have to come to the decision on their own that they want something different. And that's the heartbreak. And so I think this is why, we need to invest deeply into the lives of 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds, because they are where that critical stuff is happening. And Amira, one of the things I really thought about is, as an adult who being where I am, one of the best things I can do is try to invest in parents, right? And invest in helping them help their kids, or invest in them having a more stable situation so they can be there for their kids. Because I can't have that relationship, right, with their kid, but they can. And if I help them stabilize, then maybe they can continue to be or build into being that person for their child.
Is it similar, the effects that trauma has on a child's brain, is it similar to, early exposure to, drugs or alcohol?
So the exposure to substances which can cause dependence, right, is going to cause specific changes in parts of the brain such that without those substances, there will be a dysregulation, there'll be a hyperactivity, there'll be, a withdrawal, basically. And that's a little bit different from having a brain, right, that's constantly bathed in, stress hormones from birth on, right? And so it does show up a little bit differently, and the recovery is differently. Unfortunately, sometimes those things go together. But no, I think it's different to have constant stress hormones around versus saying, I, was born with having been exposed to something that was addictive. As I was born, I then withdrew and had a hyperactive part of my brain. I think that's a little bit different from saying every day I walked into a world of stress and never had a break from that stress, because I never had a safe adult relationship to create an oasis for me and respite from the storm.
The question I had, because you talked a lot about how the body doesn't forget trauma and a bit about trauma, I wanted to know, how does trauma express itself through violence? Like, how does that occur?
So let's talk a little bit about how trauma shows up in our body first, because that's important. So one of the most common ways is sleep disturbance, because the brain is caught in a fight or flight, hyperactive, hypervigilant, somebody's trying to threaten me state. It never gets to the point of relaxation, and so you have a lack of sleep. That same hypervigilance affects your intestines and your ability to digest. So frequently people have all kinds of GI, gastrointestinal upset. They're the super picky eater, upset stomach all the time, always having trouble trouble using the bathroom. Just always something is up with the GI tract. Another way it can show up is pain in the joints, especially pain in the joints that feels like arthritis, even though you're 25 and you shouldn't have arthritis yet. Another way is that hypervigilance can show up is a very, very, very low thresholds for anger, that anything will piss you off and you'll respond with anger rather than nuance. So how does that translate into violence? Okay, so let's think about that. Conflict will come, right? It's going to be times, whether it's the person driving beside you in the road or somebody who posted something on social media or somebody in your family mouthing off, where you're going to come into conflict, right? People are going to say things and do things that are not necessarily immediately physically threatening, but they will be threatening. If you're already in a state where your body is harboring this trauma, your fight or flight response is right at the tip, is right there. And so when somebody does that little thing, instead of being able to be like, yeah, okay, you're tripping, you are boom right there. And then if you add to that everyone being in that zone, then it starts getting really real. Because one of the things that happens with the hypervigilance that comes from trauma exposure is a need to protect yourself. And suddenly you don't just got people with fists and words. You have people with knives and bullets. And everybody has knives and bullets. Then take it a step further and make it be so normalized. Make the trauma response be so normalized and just ingrained in everyone, it literally becomes the fabric of the culture, such that the more, right, you are close to it, the more you have seen, right, the more teardrops tattooed on your face, the more videos of people bleeding out you have on your Facebook feed, the more clout you have, because you have now come into position where you are the master of that trauma. You laugh at it. You expect it. You want it. You deal with it. And you are so removed at that point from a response which preserves life. Nobody can tell you anything. And the thing about it is, you are not wrong. That's a completely reasonable standpoint to have when everyone around you has trauma and everyone around you is armed. And it is a vicious self-perpetuating cycle. The question I have, and the question I'm burning to find in all of my work, is how to break that. Because the person who steps out of it immediately becomes vulnerable. They don't have clout. They don't have protection. They're not hard anymore. And they are themselves now vulnerable. This is some really, really deep stuff that I think we need to deal with specifically in the Black community. The thing about it is, when you throw the word mental health at it, of course that don't seem like enough, because it's soft compared to the hardness of walking around on a battlefield. This is the line that I draw. Now, there's a lot of people who would say, you know what, you're making it too easy on people. People make a choice to do things to hurt other people, and it has nothing to do with their prior trauma exposure. They just think they can get away with it, and they just do it. But I know the human mind and body, and I know that given enough access to love, trust, food, shelter, and resources, people do not choose violence as the norm. And my desperate hope is to get more and more and more and more young folks deeply desiring that zone of being and not staying entrenched in the normalized violence that has become our relationship with trauma.
Wow. Earlier in 2020, we released a different podcast under the same name, Understanding Trauma, but it was a lot shorter. And so now we have a little more time to expound on things that maybe didn't get enough attention in the first podcast. But in that podcast, I believe you spoke on how trauma and addiction are actually closely related. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think there's this thought can go in two very different directions. So the one direction is the way in which we become addicted to the emotions and physiological response of trauma. In other words, trauma is a drug. But the other way is the way in which drugs are extremely good at managing the negative side effects of exposure to trauma. So let's start with the first one. When you get exposed to stress, your body releases, again, stress hormones and different kinds of neurotransmitters in your brain and hormones that circulate through your entire body that cause you to be in a certain state, right? When that is your everyday norm, right, especially as a young person, we're very good at surviving, right? So we start saying, well, I guess it's just how it is then. This is life. I like it now. I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to be like, okay, this is my life and this is what family is. You even start to say, this is what love is. And so then as an adult, what can end up happening because of those exposures in your childhood and your family of origin is you only feel attracted to somebody or you only feel at home when the vibe brings up that same trauma. And so you are literally addicted to your negative trauma experiences. And every choice you make in life is just to recreate what feels like home. Even if your conscious brain is like, this is so messed up. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep dating the same people? Why do I keep messing up the same way at work? Why do I keep trying to repair this relationship? And no matter what I do, my dad never, ever is cool with me. Like, these are the things that like we just get used to. We normalize it. And there's a healer called the holistic psychologist, and she talks a lot about the way in which the work of adulthood, even young adulthood, is to begin reparenting yourself and redefining what love is outside of what might have been some very, very negative, toxic experiences as a young person, depending on what your home life was like. If your home life wasn't like that, then sometimes you're going to look at other people and you're going to be like, why do they think like that? Like, why is she always tripping? I'm just trying to love her. Or why is he always like going on like why doesn't he trust it? I'm just trying to help. It's because they can't. So that's the way in which trauma is like a drug. But the other thing, though, is that most substances that are mind altering, right? Things like alcohol, things like anything that's an opioid, and quite honestly, even the THC in hemp, right? Marijuana, they are ways to disconnect your brain from your body. They are ways to disconnect your emotions from your thoughts. They are ways to dissociate and be set free from that cognitive process. And I think one of the reasons why substance use disorder and overdose in opioids is hitting us so hard right now, and in general is such a problem, is because it works. Like, it works. Drugs work. And they allow you to control your situation very powerfully. The problem is your body gets dependent on them. It changes its biochemistry and neurochemistry, and suddenly you can't live without them. And then suddenly all the physical changes that happen in your body from constant exposure to those substances begin to occur, and you can get very, very sick and even die. So, all of this, right, is about our brain-body relationship, about the way in which we deal with negative influences in our life, and whether or not we are able to use our body to be well and to heal our mind, or whether or not we have to check out and rely on toxic people and toxic substances to survive. And breaking that mold, I'm going to tell you guys, I'm not going to lie, I'm right here with it. I mean, I have to make conscious decisions every single day, right? To choose to be well and to choose to be healthy and not let myself fall into the cycle of using toxins to deal with my own trauma.
Yeah.
Wow.
Same.
Oh, man.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, Dr. Punch, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. We definitely look forward to a continued partnership, us continuing to work together. Once again, thank you. We hope to get you for more podcasts as well, just to continue to hear your opinions on things, and things that you've learned and picked up in a very full life. or whatnot. So we thank you so much for joining, and we thank everybody for tuning in to StitchCast. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast enough to continue to tune in as we continue our series on trauma, as we continue to understand in hopes to combat and to heal. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Punch. Thank you so much, StitchCast, and thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in.
StitchCast Studio Session 2 in 2021 is sponsored by the Spirit of St. Louis Women's Fund 3-year grant from 2020 to 2022, Arts and Education Council PNC grant, and Lush Corporation's The Charity Pot. This episode of StitchCast Studio Special Edition, The Divided City, is funded by the Divided City Initiative. The Divided City is a joint project of the Center for Humanities and the Sam Fox School, College of Architecture and Urban Design at Washington University in St. Louis. The Divided City is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation.
They say who that, but you already knew that. That be them story stitches, story stitches, story stitches, story stitches, story stitches.